Hello everybody and welcome to part 16 of Kerbal Space Program. The journey continues. We start this episode, as we did last episode, in orbit around Kerbin with our space station, the Aristotle. Not to add bits this time or to take any bits off. No, 40 days have passed on Kerbin since we last met. We're just here to check on our science lab. We have two Kerbals in the lab at the moment and they are trying their hardest to work through as much of the science as is possible, ready for this station's decommissioning. We'll be bringing back all of our missions to Kerbin shortly. I want them to dock with the new station, so we don't have too long before we have to transfer everything across to there. In the meantime, however, Jeblorf and Gwenby Kerman just have to get on with the slow grind of converting the data aboard that laboratory into science that we can transmit back down to Kerbin. And here we are after a 40-day wait, ready to transmit our next batch. We have 435 units of data aboard that science lab, down about 300 from its peak. But of course, as the amount of data drops, so does the efficiency, so does the rate at which you convert it into science. We're not going to get through it all, we just have to keep going as long as is possible and hope we get through a pretty big chunk of it. 50 days later and we find ourselves here in orbit around Joule with our gravity probe, the Juno, and after talking about it for quite a while now, it's time to start bringing our craft home. Unlike the last time we tried to manoeuvre this probe, this time we do actually have line of sight to Kerbin, which means we can plan manoeuvres, which is handy because otherwise this probe would have been stuck in the orbit of Joule for a while yet. So we start planning our manoeuvre. Now, this took me a while. This took me more than 10 minutes, which, when you're playing KSP, is an absolute age to spend on planning a single manoeuvre. It didn't help that I inputted the values incorrectly to start with and then had to spend ages just trying to fudge it to get an encounter, but eventually we do get an encounter. We'll have to perform a correction manoeuvre later on just to make sure we're going the right way around Kerbin in an orbit that isn't too inclined, but, well, we've got an encounter and that's good enough for now. With that dialed in, we time accelerate round the planet until we get close to our manoeuvre node. We point ourselves in the right direction. No manoeuvre node hold on this probe core. It's starting to show its age a bit, this probe. And then we await the moment when we can begin our transfer burn. We start the burn a little later than the burn time indicator would appear to suggest we should, but that's fine. With these nuclear engines, the burn time is almost always an overestimate. I do have better burn times installed, but at this stage I'm not sure if it's minimising the problem or causing the problem. I'll have to do more investigation on that. But with that tiny Candle nuclear engine, it's a long burn regardless. With that burn complete, I check the map view and we haven't got an encounter with Kerbin straight away, so I fiddle about a bit. I discover that by burning retrograde, the closest approach gets closer, so I keep burning retrograde until we've got an encounter. I keep fiddling about with it some more, trying to close that down as much as possible, but in the end we're going to need to do a correction manoeuvre anyway, so I decide I'll leave it until we're a little closer to Kerbin. So the Juno is on its way home. Now, despite being the first of the three craft to leave, it will be the last to arrive. It has a journey of nearly 3 years to get back to Kerbin, and who knows what we'll be up to at that point, but at least we know that at some point the Juno and its bounty of science will be arriving back at Kerbin. 10 days after that, we are back with our orbital science station, the Aristotle. Over the preceding 60 days, our science lab has managed to fill itself back up with science, so we get that transmitting back down to Kerbin. There's 335 data left remaining on that lab, its output slowing all the while, but I'm starting to feel optimistic about the amount of science we are going to get out of this thing before we have to send the entire station to its inevitable fiery demise. 20 days after that, and it is time for our two remaining vehicles to start making moves in the direction of home. We start at Eve, where our interplanetary craft, the Galileo, is currently sat in an 800-kilometre orbit above the surface, and its crew of Valentina, Jebediah, Bill and Bob are making their final preparations for departure. Now, as I discussed in the last episode, we could have done this burn quite a bit sooner with the Galileo, but of the three craft we're looking at today, the Galileo was the one which had the shortest journey time, it was the one that was in the least ideal orbit around its planet, and it's the one whose fuel situation is the most precarious, although it's not really that precarious. So despite the fact we'd like this craft back as soon as possible, the Delta V requirements for this burn were decreasing the longer time went on. So I decided I'd make this burn at roughly the same time I make the burn with the Ptolemy to bring it back from Juno. It seemed to be a sensible compromise to me. We start planning our manoeuvre, and although I entered the initial values correctly this time, our luck doesn't improve and we don't get an encounter with Kerbin straight away. Again, I have to spend a very long time fiddling about with this, but eventually we do get ourselves a decent encounter with a burn of about 18,500 meters per second of Delta V. Now at this point the burn time indicator appears to lose all vestiges of sanity. It puts the burn time at 3 hours 9 minutes. I know this burn is not going to take me 3 hours and 9 minutes. I estimated at somewhere between 10 and 20 minutes, so I'm going to work from that. We get the Galileo round to the point where I'd start burning if it was a 20-minute burn, but looking at it, we're not really far enough round the planet, so I decide to treat it as if it's a 10-minute burn, and then just cross my fingers and hope I'm not too far out. So we get to the appropriate moment, we light up those engines, and after a little while of uncertainty, it becomes apparent that I was pretty much spot on with my 10-minute burn estimate, and we finish our burn with everything having gone pretty ideally. Ideally, that is, apart from the fact we don't have an encounter with Kerbin. So I set up a correction manoeuvre almost immediately, we burn through that, and now we are on course to reach our destination. Again, we'll probably need a correction manoeuvre as we get a little bit closer to Kerbin, but for now at least we are on the right track, and we will arrive at Kerbin in 187 days, which really does set the clock ticking for the Aristotle. So, to finish our trio of returning craft, we head to Juno, where the Ptolemy is in orbit, having completed its expedition to Juno's moon Ike. It was the first time away from the Kerbin system for our crew of Kerdard, Donfort, Bargel, and of course Johnny Kerman, and they've performed admirably, but after all this time away, I'm sure they're eager to get home. Now, much like the Galileo, we are not waiting for an optimal transfer window. That's not for a very long time, but we're in a good orbit to burn from, and we've got more than enough Delta V to make that burn as we are. So we start planning our manoeuvre. This goes a lot smoother. I don't get the manoeuvre node positioned quite right to begin with, but after I reposition that and fiddle about with the other parameters, we get ourselves a transfer burn of nearly 2,300 meters per second, which is roughly in line with what I was expecting. So with the manoeuvre planned, we get the Ptolemy ready for the burn itself. For regular viewers of this series, yes, the engines had switched themselves over to using monopropellant again, and I think because I didn't switch them over to using liquid fuel before I started planning the manoeuvre, that's caused the burn time indicator to just completely give up in this case. So I have no idea how long this is going to take me. It's a heavier ship, there's much more fuel on board. We've also got the lander, which is heavier than the Eve skimmer, which is on the Galileo, so I just have to guess. I guess at about 15 minutes, and once again, hope I'm not too far out on that, although this time I do have the Galileo as kind of a reference frame for this. With everything prepared and the ship in position, then we commence our burn. We light up those 3 Lantern nuclear engines, which are going to push us onto our return trajectory. It turns out I did underestimate the amount of time this burn would take, but only by about 2.5 minutes, which I think is pretty good going. And we finish our burn and then go to check the map view to see if we have picked up that encounter with Kerbin. Once again, no we haven't, but this time it turns out that I could have got an encounter if I'd stopped burning a little bit sooner, which is kind of irritating, but after firing up the RCS thrusters just to make some fine adjustments, we do have ourselves a good encounter with Kerbin. We are lined up much better with this transfer, which makes it a lot easier to make fine adjustments to our approach to Kerbin. I tried to make it so that we're going the right way around Kerbin, but I can't quite make it out from this map view. So once again, we'll have to wait until we're a lot closer to Kerbin and then see if any adjustments need to be made. The Ptolemy has a longer journey time than the Galileo. The Galileo was 187 days. The Ptolemy, it's going to be a little over a year, but at the very least, all 3 of our expeditions are now on their way home. So I suppose the most appropriate thing for us to do now is to switch our focus back to Kerbin and to redouble our efforts to make sure that all of these craft have something to actually come home to. So it's back to Kerbin and back to the KSC, where we are launching one of our Brunel Mark I rockets, yet again with another ridiculous looking fairing attached. Kerbin Kerman is in command for this one, and he is joined by Erison and Grados, and their mission is a simple one. It's to go up and deliver yet more parts to our new and rapidly expanding space station. Much like last time, this is a relatively light payload, so much like last time, we have toned down those SRBs a bit. We're also performing our gravity turn a little gently than I would usually do, because I'm not sure how that massive fairing is going to affect the whole aerodynamic balance of the craft. We don't run into any such problems, however, and the journey up is a smooth one. I am still thinking of making a different launch vehicle, something with a slightly wider base, just so that when we do this kind of launch it doesn't look quite so ridiculous, but for the moment, the Brunel does the job. Once we're in space, we can deploy that fairing and see what goodies we have for today. It's not a lot, it's just another one of those 6-way nodes and another tapered docking port. I could have brought up more, but not only is the design kind of evolving still, also with the bits we'd have brought up, the order we'd have had to attach them in, it would have meant the heaviest things would have been sort of on the end of a very long, well, what would effectively be an arm, and manoeuvring that would not have been ideal, so we're going to do it in multiple lifts. Arriving at the space station, we find ourselves pretty ideally placed to begin our docking manoeuvres, but it's not going to be long until we lose the light, however, so it's a bit of a race against time to get this first part docked on, but once that is securely attached, we can just time accelerate out of the shadow of Kerbin at our own convenience. Once in bright sunlight, we can begin the rest of our manoeuvres. First of all, we need to once again move that utility module to a different docking port. We're going to attach it to the node we've just placed on the station. That node, by the way, will form the lower boundary of the pressurized section of our space station. Once we remove that utility module, I suddenly realise I haven't put anyone in the cupola module on the space station. It's got no way of keeping itself steady, and it is slowly spinning out of control. So I transfer Kerbin Kerman across, we get that steady, we get that realigned, and now we can get on with our task. And with that attached, we've got one last thing to do. So we manoeuvre ourselves down, we grab hold of that docking adapter we've just brought up, and we're going to manoeuvre that up to where the utility module just was. And that's going to serve as the station's main docking port for craft like this Brunel CSM, the Mark II shuttle and its successor, and of course the Mark III shuttle as well. With everything in position and with the pressurised section of our space station nearly completed, our Kerbals can pat themselves on the back and head for home. Once again, we're not going to burn straight for re-entry. This time it's not to do with avoiding coming down on the night side. This time I'm just going to continue my efforts to see if I can get a good landing procedure to get our command module back to the KSC or somewhere roughly in its vicinity. We started the burn a little later than I was intending to, and we come down not far off of the coast of the KSC, which means if we burned in the right place we probably wouldn't be too far off, but I imagine we'll have plenty of opportunity to refine this further. And just such an opportunity crops up almost immediately as we once again blast off from the KSC, and this time I think I've outdone myself with the fairing. It's quite a sight to behold. It does cause us problems a little bit later when we start turning and we nearly lose control, but I do manage to just about keep it together. Anyway, Greyford Kerman is in the main seat for this one, and she is joined by Erison and Kerbin. The mission is pretty much the same as last time. Just go up, deliver a couple of parts to the new space station and come back down again. Obviously, one of the parts requires that ridiculous fairing. I mean, I do like the parts we're building this space station out of, the near future construction parts, the octo-girder parts. I mean, they really do just look perfect for the job, but my god, the fairings you need to bring some of the stuff up. Ugh. But anyway, with our crew in space, they can pop that fairing, and we can see what we've brought up this time. It's another one of the docking arms which the interplanetary craft are going to use, and also a general-purpose structural part to which we are going to attach some of the more serious hardware that we're going to be using before too long. I think once we've got this attached, we're kind of into the home straight with regards getting this station to the point where we can transfer everything across. Obviously, at the moment, we're just using that utility module for power. We'll need some kind of more permanent arrangement there, but just one or two more lifts, and I think that's it. When we arrive at the station, we are in Kerbin's shadow, but sunrise isn't too far away, and by the time we get that first part attached, we are already in the glow of the star Kerbal. Fun fact, this is the second time I've done this mission, because the first time I put the docking port that we're using to attach to the space station here on the wrong way round, so this bit of the mission didn't go so well. With that firmly fixed at the second time of asking though, we can now move on to attaching that second docking arm, and with that we have our docking points for both the Ptolemy and the Galileo sorted out. As I said, we are so very nearly there with this space station, but for now, all our Kerbals can do is bid it farewell and make their way back to the surface. Once again, we're aiming for the KSC on our way down. I burn in exactly the place I want to this time, but we still fly over. In fact, we land in almost exactly the same place. I think a little bit closer to the KSC, but not so much that you'd really notice, so that still needs a lot of work. But that'll have to wait for another day. We have all three of our vehicles on their way home, we have the new space station approaching some form of completeness, and we have our Kerbals here not far off the coast of the KSC, awaiting recovery, and that is where we are going to leave today's episode. I hope you've enjoyed it, everybody. I hope you'll join me next time. I hope you'll follow me on Twitter at SonofSmithGames, which is the first time I've plugged this in a video, and it feels weird. But anyway, for now, thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you next time.